Thanks for listening to Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast, keeping you up to date with the latest in American soccer. And don't forget to subscribe.
Hello everyone, welcome to Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast. Yes, I am back, another year older. My name is Steven Jodderand. Joining me on the show is Jake Wetruba. And on today's episode, Fire Sale. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second here. Listeners, you know the drill. Hit that subscribe button. Leave us a 5-star review. Follow us at Uncle Sam's Soccer Pod. Send in your comments, your thoughts, your hate mail at Jake Wetruba. We want to hear it all. Jake, I'm expecting an apology letter. We'll get to that actually next week. He's been texting Armand and I some interesting stuff. But how we doing, buddy?
God, it's so great to hear your voice. Oh, man. I really just longed to hear your voice, Steven, and it's so refreshing to hear you coming through my earbuds tonight.
Listeners, we're talking about the sale of the Fire on today's episode. We have Guillermo Rivera of The Athletic join us to talk about the situation in one of America's biggest cities. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Now, Jake, have you been paying attention to the Champions League?
I've heard about it.
Heard about it? There was big hype regarding the Americans in the Champions League. It was like an all-American group stage. Serginho Dest with Ajax, Timothy Weah with Lille, Christian Pulisic with Chelsea. Fantastic group. Might as well.
Jesse Marsch?
Well, yeah, Jesse Marsch. Nobody mentioned Jesse Marsch whatsoever. Jesse Marsch became the first American manager to coach in the Champions League. Jesse Marsch became the first American manager to win a Champions League game. Jesse Marsch won by a scoreline of 6-2 over Belgium's Ghent. My goodness, what an introduction for Jesse Marsch. Kind of been a forgotten American over there in Europe. He's been electric in the Austrian league. You know what their overall record is?
Tell me.
They're 7-0-0 with a goal differential of 28.
Let me ask you this, Steven. Listeners, let's actually make this the question of the day.
I already know where you're going with this. Listeners, we did not write this in the Google Doc, but I already know where you're going with this, Jake.
How soon until Jesse Marsch is the manager at Rasenball Sport Leipzig?
Yeah. I mean, he's been good. He's been good. This is what you want to see. Domination. 34 goals scored in the league, 6 goals allowed. Plus 28 goal differential. 5 points clear of the next best. I mean, their goal differential is what LAFC's is compared to everyone else in MLS. It's just unbelievable. The team is flying. And what a start to the Champions League. 6-2 win.
Stephen, do you want to know what my wet dream is?
Yeah, sure.
Jesse Marsch becoming manager of the U.S. men's national team in time for the 2026 World Cup.
I mean, if he continues success, and I don't even think he needs to get out of the group stage currently. If he goes and wins the Austrian league, right, does really well and just coasts. Do you think people in America are going to question whether or not they should have hired Marsch over Greg Berhalter? Because Marsch has been more successful in MLS.
I don't think Marsch wanted the national team job just now. I think he wanted to try and, I don't want to say conquer Europe, but manage in Europe and see how high up the ladder he can climb before eventually returning to America to coach the national team. Like he's going to manage the U.S. men's national team at some point, whether that's 2026 or 15 years from now, whenever it may be. I think eventually he will, but I think he wanted to see how he would do in managing football over in Europe. But listeners, let's transition to the Chicago Fire. Joining us now is Chicago Fire MLS and U.S. soccer writer for The Athletic and ChicagoNow.com. It's Guillermo Rivera. You can follow Guillermo on Twitter at FireConf. Guillermo, how are you doing tonight?
Good, guys. How are you?
We're doing well. Guillermo, we were just chatting before you came on about the Chicago Fire relevancy. And you're obviously in the city. And apart from the Bastian Schweinsteiger signing, it's been years since I feel like they've been relevant. I mean, there's been issues with attendance, obviously the supporters group, stadium location, the stadium itself, lack of winning, failure in the playoffs, even if they were to make it. The list goes on and on. And it seems like this club has just fallen off the map within MLS. Are we wrong to make an assumption as such?
No, that pretty much sums up the last decade. They have, for the most part, fallen off the map outside of the year or two of being competitive. And in 2017, they made the playoffs. They had two playoff appearances and no playoff wins in 12 years is a long time without much success. So yeah, that's the issue. You pretty much hit the issues on the head: the location of Bridgeview, the not winning, sort of antagonistic relationship with the fans, on and off. It's been a tough 10 years for the Fire.
Let me ask you this: then, what was the idea behind signing Bastian Schweinsteiger? I remember I was hyped for the signing. I remember seeing the videos at the airport, and it was a big deal. But it seems to be complete failure. And then you look at other signings across the league, whether it was David Villa with NYCFC or Ibrahimovic and Carlos Vela in the two LA clubs. Those have been relatively successful.
Well, I think the thinking was that they wanted to make a big splash and bring in a big name at that point, or at the point where he came in. They were still planning on using him as a midfielder, where he was played most of his career. Now he's a center back out of necessity, and because he's not as mobile as he once was. But that first year, or at least the first half of 2017, in tandem with Dax McCarty, they had a pretty damn good central midfield, and that propelled them into a brief stay at the top of the standings, and that eventual playoff appearance in 2017. But I think the reasoning behind Schweinsteiger was, hey, you got a chance to bring in Bastian Schweinsteiger while he was still pretty good as a midfielder, and he can still play in MLS. Obviously, he's nowhere near what he was 5, 6, 7 years ago, but they had a chance to bring him in, spent a good deal of money to bring him in, and a lot of fans had been sort of targeting and had issue with Hoffman and Andel not really spending big money on the big flashy designated players, and that was sort of an attempt by the Fire at that point to at least get in the game with some of the big teams, bring in a big splash, spend some money, and draw some attention to themselves. And they did that for X amount of months during 2017. But again, if you don't have a guy who's driving your offense, scoring goals, and leading you to wins, then that sort of hoopla and that big name is not really going to carry you much after that first year and that first few months of impact that he did have. So, Bastian Schweinsteiger is still Bastian Schweinsteiger, but again, you're playing him at center back. He's not quite what he was before. And, you have to wonder if this is his last year, because it's questionable to spend $5-6 million a year on a center back who's not even the best center back in the league. So you have to think, where are they going from here?
Guillermo, before we get into the sale of the Fire, I just want to ask you about the current season. The Fire coming off a massive 4-0 win over FC Dallas last weekend, and they currently sit 3 points behind the New England Revolution for the final playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. How would you sum up the season so far?
Well, it's been another disappointment. I mean, they've spent some money. They've brought in 3 designated players with Schweinsteiger, Nikolic, and Katai, and they went out and spent a little bit of money and brought in Nicolas Gaitan to sort of fill in that number 10 role that has been missing here for a good part of that 10-year run. So you thought, hey, you bring in Gaitan, you've got some other talented players across this roster, and some of them are a little bit older, but you would think that that sort of roster would be able to compete solidly for a playoff spot, and they've been below the red line for all of but 1 week, I think, this year. You go into now the last 3 games, and they've got a chance, but they've got to win all 3 games, and they need some help from New England, possibly falling apart here toward the end, and maybe Montreal and Orlando City having a tough time. But this year, I think, and maybe if you're looking for a couple of words to describe the entire stay in Bridgeview or the entire Hauptmann era of ownership, is a lost opportunity. And this year has been definitely another lost opportunity with a big payroll and some talented players that are just haven't clicked this year.
Let's get to the news everyone has talked about. Joe Mansueto, the founder and chairman of Chicago-based financial services company Morningstar, acquired 100% control of the Fire, buying the remaining 51% stake after acquiring 49% of the team last year. Guillermo, can you just talk about how the sale came to be?
Well, like you said, Mansueto bought in last year at 49%. And the way he explains it is that he got into MLS ownership, or at least 49% ownership of the Fire, via an interest in getting into the game and getting into MLS. He reached out to Don Garber about potentially getting involved with an expansion team or something in another city, and Garber sort of pointed him in the direction and suggested he speak to Andrew Hauptmann about buying into the Fire. And at that point, Hauptmann apparently wasn't interested in selling the team, so he did need an influx of cash, and he brought in Mansueto at 49%. I think going into this year, I don't know that a whole lot of people expected that this would be the year that Mansueto bought him out. But up until a month ago, everything I had heard seemed to indicate that Hauptmann wasn't going to sell. And as Mansueto explains it, a couple of weeks ago, or in August, Hauptmann approached him with the idea of buying his shares. And since he was already on board, it sounded like it went down pretty quickly. I think, I don't know if Hauptmann has any family reasoning or personal issues for making the move, but he's based out of Los Angeles. The last 10 years have been difficult. He does have other interests that the Handel is involved in, and it sounds like Mansueto made him a pretty sweet offer that the proverbial offer you can't refuse, and it went down pretty quickly over the last couple of weeks.
Guillermo, MLS Commissioner Don Garber has talked about how the league and individual clubs have seen success with 2 things: a downtown stadium and local ownership. Mansueto would like to build a soccer-specific stadium in downtown Chicago, but can you envision a scenario in which Soldier Field is the long-term solution for the Fire?
No. They were in Soldier Field before. I mean, Soldier Field works perfectly for international friendlies. It works perfectly for, Mexico and against USA in the Gold Cup final. It works for your random international friendly or random friendly between Chivas USA and Club America. But it's really not a good soccer stadium. And if you've ever been to Soldier Field, for an MLS regular season game, I can't imagine that they see this as a long-term home. Soldier Field, they were in Soldier Field before and ended up leaving. I think the idea of Soldier Field is a lot more attractive than the reality of Soldier Field. And I think they'll find that out over the next year or two. Their initial rental agreement or lease agreement is with the city, with the partners tickets for 3 years, and they've got options for up to 10 or 11 seasons there if they need to. I think they have to be looking at potentially moving out of there and within the next 5 to 6 years, because I think that's what it's going to take to find the land and get something built in Chicago, which nothing's ever easy in the city. But I would think that 5 or 6 years should be the maximum amount of time that they look to spend at Soldier Field. I know Mansueto sort of mentioned that the soccer-specific stadium isn't right at the top of their list right now, but because they've got so many logistical issues to deal with in the move to Soldier Field. But I think if they're going to thrive or really stay consistently up top with the rest of the teams, the bigger teams in the league, I think they've got to find their own stadium within the city. And that's sort of no-brainer for as far as I'm concerned.
So, Guillermo, would you say that a soccer-specific downtown or a soccer-specific stadium downtown would almost be like a field of dreams type of thing? You know, if you build it, they will come for Fire fans?
Yeah, that's probably not a bad way to look at it. I mean, you're playing in a 60,000-seat NFL stadium, or you're playing second fiddle to the Bears or to concerts or whatever special event the park district might have. And the Bears are always going to rule Soldier Field. So playing second fiddle in a 60,000-seat stadium where you've only drawn 12, 13, 14,000 over the last couple of years, the combination isn't good for where the Fire are right now in terms of reality. And hoping that the park district is saying that they'll be happy with 15,000 people in the stadium next year, but 15,000 people in a 60,000 seat stadium is not a good look.
Right.
So you can only do that for a couple of years, even if let's say everything goes as well as they can hope, and they've got some big names and they've got a successful team that's competing for the top. I mean, let's say they draw 25,000 people at a game. That's still 25,000 in a 60,000 seat stadium. That's a challenge to get to for a lot of people. You know, they've made a lot of they've made a lot out of the public transportation and being right down on the lakefront, and Soldier Field. I mean, you're still a good 15-20 minute walk from public transportation. It's a absolute nightmare to get in and out of if you're not taking public transportation. So there's a lot of challenges to Soldier Field that are going to pose a problem. I think at some point, like you said, the Field of Dreams and the ultimate fantasy or a dream for the Fire and Fire fans is to have their own soccer stadium somewhere centrally located that is reasonably close to public transportation and isn't more than 30,000 seats. So that's, like I said, not something that's not going to get done easily, and it's not going to get done quickly. So within the next 5 to 6 years, I would think that has to go down. At least that has to be the time frame for them.
Is there land
to make another move?
Is there land available?
Is there land in Chicago?
Because
there are.
I mean, there's issues in Boston, New York, with two clubs there trying to find stadium locations downtown.
Same with exactly. Yeah, I mean there are parcels, but there are properties that would require a substantial amount of infrastructure cost just to make them viable. There's just no perfect spot that's available and sitting for them right now. And there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done in order to find a piece of property that works. There's no perfect site that's sitting there readily available for them. The way that I think fans want to see a site where you can get off the L and walk right to the stadium, or something that's easily accessible for everyone. You've got the United Center on the west side. Wrigley Field is not easy to get to. Soldier Field's not particularly easy to get to. The White Sox Stadium is reasonably easy to get to, but that's a little bit further south. They want to be downtown in that downtown area, and there's no real area sitting there readily available and open for a soccer stadium without some massive reorganization and infrastructure cost. And there was some talk last year about Sterling Bay, another local developer here, bringing a USL team in at the north side, Lincoln Yards project, and that fell through because the politicians didn't want a soccer stadium in their neighborhood. So there's a lot of challenges. There's no perfect answer here. There's no easy answer for the Fire at this point.
Now, Guillermo, I wanted to touch on the potential rebrand of the Chicago Fire, which seems to be a key talking point for some of the fans. In your sit down with new owner Joe Mansueto earlier this week on The Athletic, he admitted that, yes, they are looking to potentially rebrand the club, and he mentions that he does like the name, but they're going to do their due diligence and speak with the necessary parties to figure out if the team is best to move forward with the Fire or rebrand as they move into Soldier Field. And our question is it a worry for the club that when the team gets Googled, a TV series pops up?
Yeah, I know Nelson Rodriguez had mentioned that concern before. The TV show is not going to be around in 5 years, and the Fire still will be, or I'm assuming they will be. I don't think the TV show Google search complaint is that big of an issue. I don't think the name is going anywhere. From when Mansueto indicated he likes the name, but everything I've heard seems to point to the Chicago Fire name remaining, but it sounds like there'll be some sort of upgrade or some sort of a change or a tweak to the badge and the logo. There's been some talk about changing the uniform colors, which would probably be a mistake and anger some fans. But as far as the rebrand goes, I think Chicago Fire, whether they, and they're already Chicago Fire soccer clubs, whether they make more of an effort to market themselves as Chicago Fire SC or something else, I think the Fire name itself isn't going anywhere.
And Guillermo, last question here before we let you go. In the past, there has been issues with the Fire front office and the fans. Has Mansueto discussed how he'd like to ease some of the friction between the fan base and the club?
Yeah, that's one of the things I didn't get to really delve into too much with him this past Tuesday, and the sort of friction that has been prevalent over the last decade with previous ownership and the fans, and some of it at the beginning of the season had sort of been quieted down, and a truce had been called, but now some of the fans are taking exception, or Section 8 and is taking exception to not only the Fire stance, but MLS's stance in general regarding the iron front signage and the iron front, I don't know the word I'm looking for, the iron front sort of stance against fascism. So that seems to be something that's boiling under the surface at the moment as well, and that seems to be a league-wide issue. It doesn't. I don't know that that's just a Fire issue at this point. I would be interested in seeing what Mansueto's stance is on that at this point either. But that's something I didn't really get to ask him on Tuesday, and I'm sure it'll come up in future sit-downs. I would be curious to hear what his stance is on that right now.
Right. That's definitely an interesting situation regarding the fans of iron front flag as well, and it's a league-wide issue, as you mentioned. But
yep.
Guillermo, we really appreciate you taking the time, speaking with us, talking about the Chicago Fire. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to add anything you like to plug or anything else you wanted to add about the Fire and the state of soccer in the Chicago area.
No, I think you can catch me at The Athletic or at FireConf, but I think the Mansueto change is a good thing because it's brought some optimism and some hope to the Chicago market that really hasn't been here in the last decade or so. So you're bringing in now that you've got a guy that's apparently ambitious and looking to spend some money, and he's got a lot of money to spend. I think it's a good sign, and hopefully things start to turn around here, because I think MLS needs the Chicago market to be competitive with LA's, New York's, Atlanta's, and all the other big teams if they want to really get to the point where they think they're going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. They need Chicago.
Great. Well, appreciate it, Guillermo.
Thanks, guys.